Hello and welcome once again to an edition of Sun Dragon Tips and Tricks. I'm Rebecca. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in downtown Brevard, North Carolina, and it's Sun Dragon at home. I'm at my house. And I wanted to talk to you today. I've been promising for a little bit to do a video on cable charts. And that is the graph representation, something like this. This by Sari Norlund has a lot of cables in it. And most, if not all of it, it is the pattern. It has a whole lot of charts in it. And some patterns, like what we're doing for our winter knit along with cables, is the Lazy Sunday collection by Tin Can Knits. And that has charts and written instructions. I believe this one only has charts. And so if you're trying to keep track of all this and do all this, some knowledge of charts is really helpful. Charts may seem overwhelming at first. However, I think if you get the visual understanding of them, not everyone's a visual learner. Some people really prefer verbal. They prefer the words all written out. Charts are really neat though once you get the hang of them or get more familiar with them, in that they are a representation of what you're going to make. If you can decipher the symbols, and good patterns should have a key to all the symbols, but if you can wrap your brain around what it's trying to tell you, it can be very helpful in keeping track of your knitting and in what you're doing. So we're going to break this down a little bit today to try to help make sense of what is going on with charts. Let's get to it. This video is more going to be on how to process the charts than on the actual mechanics of cables. I've done another cable video on that to help you all out with that. So, some things to keep in mind for cable charts. So charts in general is a place to start if you haven't done charts before at all. Charts in general, they really are a graph. Often the pictures of them will look like a graph with lots of squares. And each square represents one stitch. Just one stitch. One way to think about it is it's a pictorial representation. It's using symbols to show what the right side, the outside, the side facing most people, will look like when it's finished. It's trying to give you a heads up. If you know what you're looking for, it can be really, really helpful to identify what is going on the outside, the right side of your work. Now, I put up here using symbols because there is a symbol for each stitch to let you know when you have to do something different for each square. And I really firmly believe a good pattern will have a key that will tell you what every single symbol means. There's a little bit more of a universal language in crochet charts than in knitting ones. Sometimes knitters come up with their own symbols. There's a few that are pretty common, and then sometimes people come up with their own symbols. So I really tell people, look for the key. A good chart will have a key that tells you what every symbol means. Things to keep in mind for every single chart. Usually, sometimes there are variations from the norm, but they are usually read from the bottom up, because usually you are knitting from the bottom up and it will grow underneath you. So what you will look at as you're knitting, what's underneath you, you will look at from bottom up. It's the easiest way to try to explain this. Is it starts where your knitting starts. If you're knitting back and forth, down here is where you started as you keep producing more rows above. So it's usually read from the bottom up. That's very important to keep track of. Right side rows are usually read from right to left. It is actually the direction you are knitting. Sometimes that's a little bit of a head turn, but it is the direction you are knitting. Most knitters knit this direction. The stitches move towards the right, but you're knitting the stitches as you come to them. And when you're done, you will see the row as you have made it. Wrong side rows are read from left to right. Now that also may be a little bit of a head turn, but that is because you have turned your work around and you're working back across the same stitches. So you read that row when you're knitting flat. This is when you're knitting flat. When the back of the work is facing you, you're working in the opposite direction. So you will read them from left to right, those stitches. Again, very usually, not everyone follows this convention, but it is really helpful when it is done correctly. Usually the number of the row, the number that tells you what row you're on, will indicate where to start. And I will show you that on one of my charts in a second. When you're knitting in a circle, like on a hat, all the numbers may be over on the right, and because you're always going in the same direction when you're knitting in a circle. When you're knitting flat, you're going back and forth. I will show you an example of that in just a minute. Now, cable charts. Here is what is very specific to cable charts. A cable symbol will often be larger than one stitch, than one square on this chart, because cables involve lots of stitches. So a cable symbol will often be a rectangle covering the whole number of stitches used. So an example I put down, we talked in the last video about a C4F. A C4F, you have to break that in half to know how many stitches go on the cable and all these other things. But there are 4 stitches total in the cable. So the rectangle that is used to tell you what is going on will be 4 boxes wide. And so I'm going to do this to show where the boxes are to give it a little more depth, but then it will show the right leaning or left leaning direction. It will actually show you everything. It'll show how many stitches you're putting on your cable needle. It'll show you everything. So let's see the C4F. C4F is you're going to divide your cable in half. So you're going to have 2 stitches over here that you're going to put on your cable needle and hold in front, and then knit the other 2 stitches still on your regular needle, and then lift up your cable needle and knit those off. What will happen is these 2 stitches will end up being in front, and they will cross places. So the symbol will show that, but it will show the 2 stitches right here, that's 2, crossing in front of the other 2. The symbol itself will show the crisscross, so it will go like this. It will have the other 2 stitches also trading places, but they won't be as visible. And usually it is the other boxes around it that let you know that this is 4 stitches wide. We will look at that again on the chart, but this is a symbol that lets you know that 2 stitches are crossing in front of the other 2, and they are leaning to the left. Again, if that doesn't make sense, we'll look at it again. And when in doubt, look for the picture and find it in the key. That's what we'll do on a chart in just a second. And this is what I do down here. I often box them off or color code. I look for the whole rectangle and I will box it off. I will color code it. I will do whatever I need to help identify what I'm working with and what I'm looking for in the key. That's really it. Find the symbol, find what it means in the key, and then perform it when you come to it. So let's look at a few examples of symbols. We're going to look at some very, very basic ones in terms of charts, and then a few a little more basic ones of what you will find in a cable chart. So these two, there are many more symbols for increasing and decreasing and yarn over and all kinds of things. I believe I have a video on reading charts from several years ago that goes over more of these. Ones you might run into the most that are not cables, because there's a lot of just straight knitting between cables to make the cables look really pretty, will be a blank box and a box with a dot in it. And again, this is a representation of what you do on the right side. If there is a blank boxes are not to be skipped. They are, if they don't have a symbol in them, you knit them. Knitting them on the right side. Now, if you know anything about knitting, and if you don't, you will learn this as you go. On the wrong side, when the wrong side is facing you, you need to do the opposite thing to make it look like a knit stitch on the right side. So, a chart, if it has a blank box, you are knitting it on the right side, you are purling it on the wrong side. So it looks like a knit stitch on the right side. Now, a box with a dot in it means to purl. Those are our super basics. A blank box is a knit stitch. A box with a dot in it is a purl stitch. And just remember, if you're on the back side of your work, if you're on the side that doesn't show to the public, you need to do the opposite thing to make it stand out as that correct symbol on the right side. So a blank box on the wrong side is a purl, and on the right side is a knit. The more you work with knit and purl stitches, the more you'll become familiar with this. But for now, hopefully someone wrote it out somewhere and you look at the key anytime you're doing any chart. To look at some basic, super, super basic symbols you might see for cables. Some of these, it really depends to know if it's like this number right here. To know if it's a cable with 4 stitches or 6 or 8, it's usually something even. You'll have to look at either the grid, which we'll do in a second, or you need to look at the key. I've been doing a lot of videos with 4 stitch cables as a total number, so I'm sticking with that for right now. Remember from our last video, this is a cable with 4 stitches. The first half of the stitches are held in back. If you do that, you will end up with a cable that slants. Looks like it's slanting to the right. And that is what this symbol does. It looks like it's slanting. The piece that's on top that does the visual slanting is going to the right. Now a C4F, that means it's a cable with 4 stitches, the first half of which you're holding in front. And when you hold them in front, you end up with a left slanting cable. And that is what this picture is representing. I'm going to redraw the slants outside so we can keep our symbols as pure as possible. Now, I put in a few other pictures here of things you may run across. So the difference between this symbol up top and this symbol down here, with the written language, the only difference between a C4B and a T4B is that first letter. So if you look at the symbols, they are really, really similar, except one has a dot in it. And if we think back to blank symbols and the blank squares and the ones with dots in them, that indicates a purl stitch or some kind of purling. So this is called a twist rather than a cable in most languages. And it's essentially, you're doing the same thing. You have 4 stitches. The first 2 are being held in back, which is going to create a slant by the front stitches towards the right, but we are knitting these and we are purling the ones that we held in back. And this symbol, this is as close as we can get to saying, look, that slant that's in back, these back stitches are going to be purled. These front stitches, there's no symbol in them. They're going to be knit. It's a lot to keep track of. One of the things I tell people about this, if that's hard to keep track of, just identify this symbol, how it's different from that one. It has a dot in it, which means you are looking for a different symbol in your key code. You want to make sure you're following the correct symbols in the code based on all the details that you see in the chart. Same for the one down here. These two symbols are almost identical. The difference is there is a dot in the upper corner of this and there isn't here, which means if you were looking at your chart, this one is a C4F, this one is a T4F. It means that we're putting our half of these total number of stitches, 2 of them are going in front. The ones that are going in back, the ones that we're working first, we will be purling because of that little dot in that corner. But again, hopefully a chart, what I didn't put here are all the words of explanation a chart should have. One last thing to throw at you is you might come across something like this, C3F, and it's like, whoa, 3 is not an even number. We can't do that divide in half type of thing. Now, the words for this may give you more explanation. This picture also gives a little bit of a clue. The picture, and honestly, if I had drawn it really correctly, I probably would have drawn it a little more like this. We don't have to be precise, but I think it helps. And if we divided this into 3, see how that, even if we don't try to divide it stitch-wise based on the boxes around it, but this looks thinner than that up there. This has a very thick stripe in front, leaning to the left. This one has a thinner one. This one also is not as long as the others. I didn't draw them completely to scale, but it is not as wide. I would interpret this, if I couldn't find my words, as 1 stitch is taken off the needle and held in front. 2 stitches are knit off the regular fabric. And then if I flip this one up and knit that one, I will have 1 stitch that leans to the left in front, and 2 stitches have traded places with that. It will give you a skinnier looking cable. Again, when in doubt, match your symbols to the key. So let's take a look before we move on to real yarn of what a chart, and we're going to do this chart with the real yarn. Let's take a look at what this chart is trying to tell us. The first thing to pay attention to are these numbers on the sides. So this is a chart that is being read flat. And as I mentioned before, we start at the bottom of a chart. Here is row 1. And we're going to knit across in this direction to start. And the numbers, sometimes there will be numbers across the bottom. They will go in the direction of a right side row. Notice, so the 1 is lined up with this bottom row of boxes. Then row 2, the number is over on the other side. We're going to read it in that direction because we will have flipped around to the wrong side. But notice how every row going up, 3 is starting over on the right, 4 starts over on the left, 5 starts over on the right, and continues in that way. And it is also when the right side of the work is facing you, this picture will emerge. And remember, we said over there, a blank square is a knit. So like The third stitch of row 1 is a knit. The first 2 stitches, those dots, those mean purls. So I would read this as purl, purl, knit, 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 purl, purl, knit, 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 purl, purl. Now the back side of the work, remember everything flips when you're on the wrong side. So I would do, it looks like a knit stitch, this first stitch, but I would do a purl stitch because I'm on the back side. And then knit, and then 4 purls, 2 knits, 4 purls, knit, purl. So when I flip it around, it all lines up. The other thing we could do to look at this is that we are going to have, if we look at it this way, this is not the order that the rows are knit, but the columns, we will have something that looks kind of like garter stacked on top of itself here. We will have purl stitches. We're going to have a section of knitting that is going to have these twists, if you can see them. These are our cable symbols, but they imply that every 4th row, I mean, it does start on the 3rd, but after that, every 4th row, we will have some kind of twist in our stitches. And if you can back up and take a look at the big picture of this, we're going to have a column over here where the stitches twist this way, and a column over here where the stitches twist the opposite direction. So the one on the right is going to twist to the right, and the one on the left is going to twist to the left. But what this chart helps us break down is all the rows where we just have knit your knits and purl your purls, or very small variations of that. And it's only on row 3, row 7, and row 11 where we have other things happening. And this is where I said it can be really helpful to box out your cable patterns, because again, all the squares that are squares have their own interpretation in the chart. And then when you get to these guys, they can look really crazy. So anything you can do to help identify what is going on, I would say make a box or fill them in. It's easier for me, since I don't have colored pencils here, to make a box. I have a symbol that takes up all of this space, all of that space. And if we look underneath it, it is 4 stitches wide, and it slants. The big piece, uninterrupted, slants in that direction. Now, if I look across the row, this is also a big symbol that is 4 stitches wide, but the big piece doesn't go towards the right, it goes towards the left. So I'm going to make it a different color. I'm going to box this in the blue. And if I need to, I can also make an arrow about the big piece in front. Which direction does it lean? Now, if I look at the rest of this chart, I can say, okay, I see a big piece that leans to the right, so it needs a box in pink. And I can go across, or I could go up, and I could say that's another one where it leans up and to the right, so I'm going to box it in pink. So these are all the same symbol, and over here I have a piece, the big chunk of it leans to the left, up to the left. So I'm going to box it in blue, and here's another one that leans up to the left. So I'm also going to box this out in blue. Now I can look over, it's right in the corner here, I can look over at my symbols, and I can say one that goes up to the left There's my blue symbol. So whenever I have something boxed in blue, I'm going to follow the instructions for C4F. And whenever I have a symbol where the diagonal leans up and to the right, that's a C4B. That's for the ones I've outlined in pink. So that is going to help me understand what to do on this chart. And everything else, if there is a box without a symbol in it, on the right side I'm knitting, wrong side I'm purling. And if it's got a dot in it, on the right side I am purling, on the wrong side I'm knitting. Notice I've also set this up the way that many cable charts and cable patterns will do it. We are only cabling on the right side. That's when we're starting over here. These odd rows, when we're starting over on the right, those are the only ones that have cables in them. Usually your set rows, you're not usually cabling on the back side of your work, but there are exceptions to every rule. So I'm not going to move this chart while I work this piece because we want to look at the chart and see if we can understand what we're supposed to do. So hopefully my yarn won't wipe away too much of my dry erase chart. But I have already knit up a sample here. This was 14 stitches wide. I have 14 stitches here. And if we take a look, I've already done the first 2 rows. So if we take a look at the V's here, I have 2 rows where I have V's stacked on top of each other, knit stitches, I call them V-necks, stacked on top of each other in 2 places on this row, 2 purl stitches in between, just like these 2 columns with dots in them. And there's a little bit extra going on either edge, but I have the 2 stitches on either side before we get in here. So if I look, I'm on row 3. If I look at what row 3 is telling me to do, it is saying to purl 2 stitches, roll my sleeves up here. It is telling me to purl 2 stitches, and then I have a pink symbol or that slant that goes up to the right. And if I find that over here, that is a C4B. I don't have all the words written out, but what I will walk you through is that is a cable that needs 4 stitches total. We're going to take half of them. We're going to take 2 stitches off. We are going to hold them in back. That's the B. We're going to knit 2 more stitches. From the regular work, we're going to flip up our cable needle and knit 2 stitches from the cable needle. We have completed our C4B, and we have a diagonal slant, just like this picture, that slants up to the right. Now to continue with this row, I see 2 purl stitches. And now I see another cable. I see one that slants up to the left, or this symbol here, which is a C4F, which I will walk you through, means 4 stitches total. I'm going to take half of those stitches, 2 of them. Front, I'm going to leave them in front. I'm going to knit the other half of the cable off of my regular needle. I'm going to flip my cable needle up and push the stitches to the other end. I'm going to knit them off my cable needle. If I put this guy down, what I have is a cable that leans, a twist, a diagonal that leans up to the left, just like that picture does. And then my instructions say to purl, those dots mean purl, purl my last 2 stitches. So what I have now, I have a twist that leans this way, and I have a twist that leans this way. I'm done with row 3. If I turn this around, here's an example. If I turn around to work on the back side on row 4, now on row 4, I want to go this direction, just like I wrote on row 2 here. So blank square means if I was on the right side, I would be knitting, but I'm on the wrong side. So I want to purl, which is the opposite of the stitch underneath it. Now I'm kind of throwing a bunch of stuff at you. The next stitch, it's the same as the stitch over it. If I was on the right side, I would be purling, but I want the same stitches I see underneath me. On this side, on the wrong side, I'm going to knit. These stitches, to make them look like knit stitches on the front, I need to purl 4 stitches across the back. Then I'm going to do 2 stitches that on the wrong side, dot means to knit. Four of the same, which on this wrong side means to purl. And then a dot, which on this side means to knit, and a blank one, which means to purl. Now, if we turn around to start our next row, to start row 5, we have a little bit clearer picture of what we are doing here. Again, it looks like all these purl bumps are stacking right in here. Knit stitches with a twist down at the bottom in 2 different directions. And now we're going to set them in place. If I read this chart correctly, I just did row 4. I have row 5. There's no cables in it. I'm just going to follow the instructions for where knits and purls go. Row 6, I'm going to follow the instructions for where on the wrong side my knits and purls should go by flipping everything. Row 7 has cables again. Then there's 3 more rows that don't have cables, another one. So I'm going to finish, or maybe I will join you all back on row 11, and we'll talk about how this chart looks like the work that I am doing when I get there. Okay, I am on row 11 now. And I have done 2 twists on either column here. 1, 2, 1, 2. It may look like this is a lot taller than what I've knit, but I'm promising you I am on row 11. Honestly, this is one place where graphs, if you're trying to plan ahead to what it will look like, stitches tend to be a little shorter than they are wide. So the square doesn't fully represent what is going to happen with your work in that the length of it. So using like a graph and color work and coloring in to make it look like a squirrel or something like that may not totally work, in that it may end up looking really squished. But I am ready. This tells me there should be 3 rows between the last cable and the one I'm about to do. And sometimes this is clearer than others. If we don't pull and push too much, if we look right at the center of our cable, 1, 2, 3, that indicates 3 rows have happened since my last cable. So it's time to do my next one. And again, if I go up to row 11 up here, I have 2 purls. This symbol with the pink that I've made pink, but the slant up to the left is a C4B. So I will take half of that 4. I will take 2 of them. B means back. I will knit the other half of the stitches in my cable from my regular needle. I will flip this up, slip to the other end, and knit 2. Two purl stitches. Another cable, what's boxed off, slants up to the left. That is a C4F. So take half of that 4, 1, 2, hold them in front, knit the other 2, flip this up and slide to the other end. And at the end it says to purl 2. So I have done everything but that final row, and I have 3 twists, just like 3 twists, that on this side, when I'm looking at the right side of the work, the correct side we could say, the cable that is over on the right is slanting this direction up to the right, and the cable that is over on the left is slanting up to the left. So I've followed those directions, and this is what my result is. So I hope that video was helpful in starting to help you process charts. Now this bigger piece I keep saying that I'm working on, I have smaller cables in here, but they are all left or right leaning. I have bigger cables out here. The number of stitches is different. So if I was identifying these all in charts, I might give each one its own color. So I know how many stitches I'm holding. Is it 2? Is it 3? What goes on the cable needle to help me figure that out? These little guys in here these little guys out here have 1 stitch going over 2 stitches in some fashion. And again, the symbol looks different. If I know what I'm looking for, if I match up visually the symbol on the chart with the key, that is really what it's all about. And sometimes color coding can be incredibly helpful. So I hope that helps you if you're engaging in any cable projects. If you like what you've seen and you'd like to support the channel, you can subscribe. You can give us a thumbs up. You can leave a comment. If you'd like to support us financially, there are memberships here. There is patreon.com/sundragon. Anything you can do, we are just grateful that you are watching and that you are commenting and liking and all of those things. As I always like to say towards the end here, may your crafting be filled with joy and confidence. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. How have you been while I've been filming, huh? Yes.